My name is Luna. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in roles that sit quietly at the center of things: operations, coordination, problem solving. The kind of work where, if you do it well, nothing looks dramatic. Everything just works. People usually describe me as calm, dependable, low maintenance. Some say easy to work with. Others mean easy to overlook, even if they don't realize that's what they're saying. I've learned that when you speak softly, people assume you don't have much to say. When you don't complain, they assume you're fine. When you carry responsibility without demanding credit, they start to believe responsibility is all you're for. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing anyone by name. And it's definitely not about shouting, quitting in a blaze of glory, or watching someone else burn. It's about something much quieter than that. It's about a promise that was made to me. A raise that was discussed, hinted at, delayed. It's about trust that felt mutual at the time. And it's about the moment I discovered that while I was being asked to just hang in there a little longer, someone new was being brought in, at a higher salary than mine. I trained them. I onboarded them. I answered their questions. I filled in the gaps no one had documented, because I was the documentation. And then very calmly, very efficiently, I was replaced. What you'll hear in this story is not a build-up to a dramatic confrontation. There was no screaming match, no slammed doors, no triumphant speech at the end where everyone suddenly realizes what they lost. Instead, this is a story about psychological reversal, the kind that happens slowly, internally, and often goes unnoticed until it's irreversible. It's about how being underestimated can become a form of leverage, how silence, when chosen consciously, changes meaning, and how dignity doesn't always announce itself when it arrives. I'm telling this now because for a long time I thought my experience was just unfortunate, personal, something I should have handled better, negotiated harder, explained more clearly. But over the years, I've realized how common this pattern is, especially for people who are competent, ethical, and not naturally performative about their value. If you've ever been the reliable one, if you've ever been told to be patient while watching opportunities quietly bypass you, if you've ever trained someone who ended up standing where you were promised you'd be, then this story might feel familiar. I won't exaggerate what happened. I won't turn anyone into a cartoon villain. And I won't pretend I handled everything perfectly. What I can promise is honesty, and a clear look at how power sometimes shifts without noise, without cruelty, and without asking for permission. So before we go any further, let me ask you one gentle question. Have you ever sensed something was unfair long before you had proof, and stayed quiet anyway, hoping your patience would be seen? I was the person people came to when something quietly broke, not the kind of break that triggers alarms or meetings. The subtle ones. A process that stalled for no obvious reason. A handoff that kept slipping through cracks. A project that was technically on track, but somehow never moved forward unless I touched it. When I joined the company, my title was modest: operations support. Later, operations lead, though the responsibilities expanded much faster than the title ever did. I learned quickly that my value wasn't in how visible I was, but in how much friction I could remove without anyone needing to think about it. I made things smoother, faster, calmer. And because of that, people rarely remembered to ask how much weight I was carrying. In meetings, I was often the one taking notes. Not because I had nothing to say, but because if I didn't, no one else would remember what was decided. When timelines shifted, I was the one quietly adjusting dependencies so nothing collapsed. When new initiatives launched, I was looped in just to help operationalize it, which was a polite way of saying, make this real so others can take credit for the idea. No one was unkind to me. That's important to say. They thanked me. They trusted me. They relied on me. But they didn't see me. I wasn't underestimated in the dramatic sense. No one doubted my competence. If anything, that was the problem. My competence was treated as a given, like electricity or Wi-Fi. Something you only notice when it stops working. In performance reviews, the language was always warm and vague. Luna is incredibly reliable. She's such a stabilizing presence. We don't worry when Luna's involved. Those were meant to be compliments, and I accepted them as such. For a long time, they were enough. I told myself visibility wasn't everything. That consistency mattered more than recognition. That if I kept doing good work, growth would follow naturally. And in small ways, it did. More responsibility, more trust, more requests that started with, "I know this isn't technically your job, but..." I became the connective tissue between departments. Sales leaned on me to interpret operations. Product leaned on me to manage expectations. Leadership leaned on me to sense-check reality when numbers looked good on slides but felt off in practice. What I didn't realize yet was that connective tissue is rarely protected when structures change. From the outside, I probably looked settled, comfortable, not ambitious in the loud, upward-climbing sense. I didn't advocate aggressively for myself in meetings. I didn't interrupt. I didn't reframe others' ideas as my own. I assumed my work spoke clearly enough. There's a particular invisibility that comes from being consistently composed. When you don't react strongly, people assume nothing affects you deeply. When you don't push, they assume you don't want more. And because I didn't broadcast dissatisfaction, it never occurred to anyone that I might be quietly measuring my worth against what I was giving. I was the person who stayed late when deadlines slipped. The one who trained new hires because you explain things so clearly. The one managers trusted with sensitive transitions because I was discreet. I told myself this was respect. In hindsight, it was reliance without elevation. But at the time, I still believed the system worked. That promises were real. That conversations about growth meant something concrete, even if they moved slowly. I didn't yet understand that when people grow accustomed to your silence, they start planning around it. And that was who I was to them then. Useful, steady, replaceable. Though no one had tested that assumption yet, the first moment didn't feel important when it happened. That's what makes it dangerous. The way it slips past your internal alarm system because nothing about it is loud enough to justify a reaction. It was during a one-on-one with my manager. A routine check-in. We'd been talking about workload, about how much the scope of my role had expanded over the last year. I had data prepared, not to prove anything, just to give structure to the conversation. Projects I'd absorbed, systems I maintained alone, dependencies that now quietly ran through me. He nodded, took notes, said all the right things. At one point, he leaned back and said, almost casually, "We should definitely talk about a compensation adjustment. You've earned that. Not might. Not someday. You've earned that." The sentence landed softly, but it stayed with me. I didn't push for details. I didn't ask for numbers or timelines. I trusted the intent behind the words. I assumed clarity would come naturally, the way it had with every other responsibility I'd taken on. A week passed, then two. In the meantime, I noticed a new meeting appear on the team calendar. Something about role realignment. I wasn't invited. That wasn't unusual. Leadership meetings often happened without operations present. Still, I made a mental note. When I asked my manager about the compensation conversation again, lightly, he smiled in that reassuring way people do when they think they're being kind. "Yes, absolutely. It's just not the right time. Budget cycles, approvals, you know how it is." I did know how it was. I'd helped plan those cycles. I'd seen the numbers. Nothing he said was overtly false. That was the second cut, not the delay, but the assumption that I wouldn't connect the dots. A few days later, HR reached out to ask me to help draft onboarding documentation for a new role. Similar to mine, but with a narrower focus. I didn't think much of it. Documentation was my language. I liked making things clear. Then I saw the job posting. The title was different, but the responsibilities overlapped heavily with what I already did. The salary band was listed publicly. It was higher than mine, not by a small margin. I stared at the number longer than I expected to. Not because I felt angry, yet, but because my body was trying to reconcile two truths that couldn't exist together. I had been told I'd earned a raise, and the company was willing to pay more for someone else to do a piece of what I was already doing. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Market adjustments. External hires always cost more. Different scope, different expectations. Those explanations weren't wrong. They just weren't complete. When I asked my manager about the new hire, I kept my tone neutral. Curious, even. He explained the business need, how the team was growing, how this role would support me and free me up for higher-level work. I nodded. That sounded reasonable. What he didn't say was that my compensation conversation was now quietly closed. Not canceled, just indefinitely deferred, buried under structural changes that made it awkward to revisit. No one told me this directly, but the energy shifted. The topic stopped coming up. When I mentioned growth again, it was reframed as future opportunities, rather than immediate recognition. That's when I realized something important. The cut wasn't in the salary. It was in the assumption of good faith. Everyone else moved on as if nothing had happened. The new role was just another line on the org chart. Another hiring win. Another sign of progress. But I remembered the sentence, "You've earned that." And I started paying closer attention to what followed and what didn't. Once something happens the first time without consequences, it has a way of becoming background noise. After that initial conversation, I noticed how easily my concerns were absorbed and dissolved into polite language. Every follow-up was met with reassurance instead of resolution. Every question about scope or growth was answered with vision instead of structure. Nothing was said outright. That was the pattern. The new hire started a few weeks later. Bright, capable, eager in the way people are when they still believe systems are fair by default. I was asked to help onboard them, temporarily of course, just to get them up to speed. I agreed without hesitation. Saying no didn't even occur to me. I walked them through workflows I'd built over years, explained which stakeholders needed extra context, which deadlines were flexible, which ones only looked that way. I shared the kind of information you only learn by being quietly accountable for outcomes no one else wants to own. They took notes, asked thoughtful questions, thanked me often. Everyone else praised how smoothly the transition was going. In meetings, my role subtly shifted. I was no longer the sole point of contact for certain decisions. Instead, I was looped in, copied, consulted after the fact. It was framed as support, as progress, as a sign that things were finally being distributed more evenly. And maybe they were, just not upward. At first, I rationalized everything. This is how growth works. You can't expect immediate recognition. Being patient shows maturity. Those were the stories I told myself, because they aligned with the version of me I was proud of. The calm one, the professional one, the one who didn't make waves over perceived slights. When the new hire asked about salary bands, casually, I felt a tightening in my chest. Not jealousy, awareness. They spoke openly about their offer, their negotiation process. I smiled, congratulated them, meant it. Then I went home and opened my notebook, the one where I kept private reflections alongside workflows. I wrote down what had happened, not emotionally, but factually. Dates, phrases, shifts in responsibility. I told myself it was just for clarity, not evidence. Meanwhile, the pattern continued. I'd raise a concern about workload, and it would be acknowledged, then redirected. I'd suggest a structural improvement, and it would be adopted, sometimes without my name attached. I'd catch errors before they escalated, and the absence of crisis would be taken as proof that everything was fine. Each instance on its own was minor, easily dismissed, not worth escalating. Together, they formed a rhythm where my contribution was assumed, my patience was expected, and my silence was interpreted as consent. The most subtle shift was internal. I stopped expecting follow-through. I stopped believing timelines. I started listening more carefully to what wasn't said. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as insult. Sometimes it arrives as inertia, the quiet confidence that you'll keep doing what you've always done, no matter how the terms change. And because I kept performing, because nothing broke, because I didn't force a reckoning, the system had no incentive to correct itself. I wasn't being punished. I was being normalized. Normalized into a role where asking for more felt inconvenient to others, where advocating for myself risked disrupting a balance that benefited everyone but me. I told myself this was temporary, but somewhere underneath that rational voice, a different awareness was forming. Not anger, not resentment, but something colder and clearer. The realization that respect, once delayed long enough, quietly expires. Roles aren't always formally given. Sometimes they emerge from repetition, from what people learn they can expect from you without needing to ask. By the time the new hire had fully settled in, I could feel the shape of mine clearly. I was the stabilizer, the person who absorbed uncertainty so others didn't have to, the one who translated chaos into order, emotion into process, ambition into something operationally possible. When leadership wanted reassurance that something would be handled, my name was used like a seal. Luna will take care of it. Let's run this by Luna. Can you sanity check this with Luna? Those phrases sounded like trust. And in a way, they were. But trust without authority is a peculiar thing. It asks for accountability without offering control. I was included everywhere, but centered nowhere. The new hire, meanwhile, was being positioned differently. Their role had a sharper edge. Clear ownership, defined metrics. They were encouraged to speak up in meetings, to challenge assumptions, to think strategically. When they did, it was praised as leadership potential. When I did the same, it was framed as support. No one ever said this out loud. It revealed itself in tone, in who was asked to present versus who was asked to prepare, in who was invited into early conversations, and who was brought in once decisions were already soft set. I noticed how often I was asked to smooth interpersonal friction, to rephrase emails, to de-escalate misunderstandings, to just have a quick chat with someone who was struggling. Emotional labor became part of my unofficial job description, and I was good at it. Too good. I understood people. I could sense when someone needed reassurance versus clarity. I knew when to push and when to pause. I had learned how to carry tension without letting it leak into the room. What I hadn't learned was how to make that invisible work legible in systems that only reward what can be counted. So the role solidified. Reliable, useful, invisible. I was the one expected to adapt when priorities shifted. Because I always did. The one who didn't need much guidance because I could figure things out. The one whose needs were assumed to be minimal because I didn't articulate them forcefully. In performance conversations, this translated into phrases like, Luna is a backbone. She's essential. She keeps things grounded. Essential things are rarely moved upward. They're kept where they are. I began to see how my calm had been misread as contentment. How my lack of complaint had been translated into lack of ambition. How my ethics, my refusal to posture or politic, had quietly limited how others imagined my future. And still, I didn't confront anyone. Not because I was afraid, but because I was trying to understand the system fully before reacting to it. I wanted to know whether this was oversight or design. The answer came slowly, through repetition. When stretch opportunities arose, they were framed as risks I was too valuable to take. When leadership roles opened, I was consulted for input, but not considered for placement. When decisions were made that affected my workload, they were presented as facts, not discussions. I wasn't excluded. I was assigned to continuity, assigned to absorption, assigned to making everyone else's role easier. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And the most sobering part was this. No one believed they were treating me unfairly. From their perspective, the system worked. I worked, which meant that if anything was going to change, it wouldn't come from pointing out injustice. There was no villain to confront, no policy being broken loudly enough to challenge. There was only alignment, quiet, efficient, and misdirected. And that realization marked the beginning of a shift I didn't announce to anyone. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. There was no email, no comment that landed too hard, no final straw dramatic enough to justify a turning point. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in the quiet space between tasks. I was reviewing a workflow document I'd written years earlier, one of many that lived in shared folders, updated by others but originally structured by me. As I scanned the page, I noticed how many annotations had been added over time. New names in the margins. New owners assigned to steps I still quietly oversaw. My name appeared nowhere. That wasn't new. What was new was how little it surprised me. I closed the document and sat back in my chair. The office around me hummed softly. Keyboards, low conversations, the muted rhythm of people moving forward without friction. Because I was there, and in that stillness, something internal recalibrated. I realized I had been waiting. Not passively, but optimistically. Waiting for someone to connect the dots on my behalf. To notice the imbalance and correct it without being asked. To reward patience as if it were a visible metric. That day, I stopped waiting, not in anger, not with bitterness, just with clarity. I asked myself a simple question. If nothing changes, how long can this version of my life continue? The answer wasn't catastrophic. It was sustainable. That was the problem. I could keep doing this for years. I could remain indispensable without being elevated. I could continue absorbing complexity while others advanced through cleaner narratives of impact. And no one would stop me. That realization was heavier than any insult, because it meant the responsibility to change things didn't belong to the system. It belonged to me. I didn't confront my manager. I didn't draft a resignation letter. I didn't even update my resume that day. What I did was quieter. I began to observe with intention. I paid attention to how decisions actually moved, who influenced them early, who merely executed them later. I noticed which contributions were remembered in reviews and which disappeared into collective success. I started documenting not just processes, but dependencies. Not just tasks, but risk points. Not just outcomes, but who would be affected if those outcomes shifted. And internally, I adjusted how I saw myself. I stopped identifying as the stabilizer. I stopped measuring my worth by how little disruption I caused. I stopped equating professionalism with self-erasure. That day, I accepted something uncomfortable but freeing. My loyalty had been one-directional. Not maliciously exploited, just assumed. Once you see that, you can't unknow it. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else. I still showed up the same way. Same tone. Same reliability. Same calm. But inside, the axis had moved. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't plotting an exit. I wasn't even certain what the end would look like. I only knew this. I would never again confuse being needed with being valued. And from that moment on, my silence stopped being automatic. It became a choice. When silence is unconscious, it's compliance. When silence is chosen, it's something else entirely. Outwardly, nothing changed. That was the point. I continued to attend meetings, continued to respond promptly, continued to solve problems before they escalated. If anyone had been asked, they would have said I was exactly the same. Internally, though, I was making decisions with a different filter. I stopped volunteering information that wasn't explicitly requested. Not out of spite, but out of accuracy. I answered questions as asked, not as anticipated. I let others experience the friction that had previously been absorbed quietly into my awareness. When a plan had a flaw that leadership hadn't invited operational input on, I noted it privately, instead of fixing it preemptively. When timelines were unrealistic, I documented the risk rather than compensating for it with unpaid labor. People began to mistake this shift for passivity. Luna seems quieter lately. She's probably just busy. She'll flag it if it's a real issue. They didn't realize I was flagging things, just not emotionally, not performatively, and not in ways that protected others from the consequences of their assumptions. Silence, when strategic, creates space. In that space, patterns reveal themselves. I watched who struggled when I stopped smoothing handoffs. I noticed how often the new hire came back to me for clarification on decisions that were supposedly now theirs. I observed which leaders assumed I would step in at the last minute, and how surprised they were when I didn't. Still, I never refused help outright. That would have drawn attention. Instead, I became precise. I can help with that. What's the priority? I can review this. What's the deadline you're working toward? I can take this on. What would you like me to deprioritize? These questions were neutral, reasonable, professional. They also forced choices. People unused to being asked to make trade-offs hesitated. They revealed how much they'd relied on my flexibility without recognizing its cost. What surprised me most was how quickly my silence was interpreted as weakness. Because I wasn't asserting myself loudly, some assumed I had accepted my place, that I'd internalized the role, that the absence of pushback meant the absence of agency. In reality, I was collecting data. I was learning where my presence mattered most, and where it was taken for granted. I was mapping the system not as it claimed to be, but as it actually functioned under strain. And I was doing something else too. I was emotionally detaching, not from the work. I still cared about quality, but from the need to be seen as good, helpful, indispensable. That need had kept me compliant longer than any policy ever could. As it faded, something steadier took its place. Clarity. I didn't rush, I didn't hint, I didn't test reactions. I waited, because when people believe you'll always catch them, they jump without looking. And when you stop standing beneath them, quietly, without announcement, they start to fall just enough to notice the absence. Not catastrophically, just uncomfortably. And in that discomfort, the truth of your value begins to surface. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like patience with intent. While everyone else assumed things were stable again, I was quietly building a clearer picture of how the organization truly worked. Beyond titles, beyond org charts, beyond what was said in meetings. I reviewed everything I touched, every workflow that routed through me, every system that relied on my judgment calls rather than written rules, every cross-team dependency that existed because someone trusted me to just handle it. I wasn't hoarding information. I was understanding exposure. I noted which processes would slow without my intervention, not because I withheld effort, but because I was the only one who understood the exceptions. I mapped where knowledge lived only in my head. Decisions made years ago, shortcuts taken to meet deadlines, agreements reached verbally and never revisited. None of this was secret. That was the irony. It was simply undocumented, uncelebrated, and therefore invisible to leadership. I began to keep careful records, not as leverage in the dramatic sense, but as clarity. I documented how long tasks actually took versus how long they were assumed to take. I saved emails where I was asked to temporarily cover responsibilities that never returned to their original owners. I paid attention to how often I was the last line of defense before something failed. What no one noticed was that I stopped being emotionally invested in preventing every failure. I still upheld my responsibilities. I still met expectations. But I stopped expanding them quietly. When asked to train others, I trained them well, but only within the scope they were meant to own. I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine by design. I stopped translating ambiguity unless it was part of my role. People assumed this meant things were finally well structured. In reality, they were simply less buffered. I also began to prepare myself, not for confrontation, but for mobility. I updated my resume slowly, thoughtfully. I didn't inflate anything. I didn't dramatize my contributions. I simply described them clearly, in language the market understood better than my workplace ever had. I spoke discreetly with a few trusted contacts outside the company. Not to complain, not to gossip, just to understand how my experience translated elsewhere. The response was consistent and surprising. You're doing the work of 3 roles. Why isn't this scoped as a senior position? How long have you been operating at this level? Those conversations didn't inflate my ego. They grounded me. They confirmed that what I had felt internally wasn't sensitivity. It was misalignment. Back at work, leadership continued to make plans that assumed my availability without naming it. New initiatives were approved with timelines that only worked if I absorbed the complexity no one else wanted. And because I was quiet, because I didn't object loudly, they never recalculated. That was their blind spot. They mistook my composure for consent, my professionalism for permanence, my silence for security. They never noticed that I had stopped anchoring my identity to their validation, that my sense of worth was no longer tied to being needed there. By the time they sensed something was different, the groundwork had already been laid, not for retaliation, not for collapse, but for a shift they wouldn't be able to control. Because preparation, when done without noise, doesn't trigger defenses. It just makes outcomes inevitable. The reveal didn't come from a single document or discovery. It emerged slowly through accumulation. One evening, after most people had logged off, I sat alone with my notebook open beside my laptop. I wasn't looking for anything dramatic. I was cross-checking, comparing assumptions with reality, promises with patterns. That's when the shape of it became unmistakable. The company didn't just rely on me operationally. It relied on me structurally. Entire timelines were built on my judgment calls. Risk mitigation plans assumed my intervention without naming it. Even the new hire's role, framed as support, functioned smoothly only because I was still quietly bridging gaps no one else knew existed. What struck me wasn't power in the cinematic sense. It was fragility. Not mine, the system's. I realized that if I stepped away cleanly, without drama, without sabotage, without withholding anything I was ethically obligated to provide, a significant amount of institutional knowledge would leave with me simply because it had never been formally recognized or replaced. Not because I was special, because no one had bothered to make my role explicit. That was the private reveal. I wasn't overestimating my value. They were underestimating their exposure. And the most important part was this. I didn't feel triumphant when I saw it. I felt calm. There was no urge to announce it, to hint, to leverage it aggressively. Power, I learned in that moment, doesn't need to posture. It just needs to be accurate. I also saw something else, just as clearly. If I stayed, nothing would change. Now that my role had been quietly redistributed on paper, advocating for myself would look like resistance to progress. Any attempt to renegotiate would be framed as emotional, even if it was factual. The system had already moved on, without fully replacing what it depended on. So I made a decision internally, before making any external moves. I would not beg to be seen. I would not expose vulnerabilities to force recognition. I would not burn bridges to prove a point. I would exit in a way that preserved my integrity and let reality do the explaining. That clarity brought an unexpected sense of relief. For the first time in months, my chest felt light. Not hopeful in the naive sense, but grounded. Anchored in reality instead of possibility. I closed my notebook and shut down my laptop. No one else knew what had shifted that night. But from that point on, every action I took was guided by one quiet truth. They believed they were prepared. They weren't. And I didn't need to tell them that for it to be true. Once you see clearly, indecision becomes impossible. What remains is choice. I gave myself time, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the decision to be clean, unrushed, free of reaction. I laid out the options the way I would for any complex system, calmly and without emotion. Option 1, stay, push for recognition again. Reopen the compensation conversation. Advocate louder. Risk being framed as dissatisfied now that support had been hired. Accept incremental adjustments that came too late and changed nothing fundamental. Option 2, confront. Lay out the imbalance plainly. Explain what I now understood about my role. Force leadership to acknowledge what they'd built on top of my silence. This option carried the illusion of justice, but also the reality of defensiveness, negotiation fatigue, and reputational cost. Option 3, leave, not abruptly, not dramatically, not with accusations or ultimatums. Leave with professionalism intact, knowledge transferred appropriately, and dignity unnegotiated. Each option had consequences. Staying would preserve stability, but at the cost of self-respect. I would always know I'd accepted less than the truth of my contribution. Confrontation might feel righteous, but it would entangle me emotionally in a system that had already shown me its limits. Even if I won, I would be fighting for space in a structure that only adjusted under pressure. Leaving was irreversible. Once done, there would be no corrections, no apologies that mattered, no delayed raises that could reframe the past. That was what made it the hardest and the clearest. I asked myself one final question, one I hadn't allowed myself before. If nothing about this job ever changed, would I be proud of the version of myself who stayed? The answer came quietly without drama. No. So I chose the irreversible option. Not because I wanted them to feel my absence, not because I wanted vindication, but because I wanted alignment between what I gave and what I received, between my values and my environment. The decision wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by respect for myself. Once the choice was made internally, everything else became procedural. I didn't announce anything yet. I didn't shift my demeanor. I didn't signal dissatisfaction. I simply began to move forward, one deliberate step at a time, without asking for permission. And that's the thing about irreversible decisions made in silence. By the time others sense movement, the outcome is already in motion. Once the decision was made, my behavior became almost ceremonial in its restraint. I didn't rush. I didn't vent. I didn't look for allies inside the company. I treated the next phase the way I treated everything else, with care, precision, and respect for consequences. First, I stabilized what was truly mine to stabilize. I reviewed my responsibilities through an ethical lens. Not what I had absorbed unofficially, but what I was formally accountable for. I made sure every core process had documentation that was accurate, current, and usable by someone who didn't think the way I did. Not simplified, not optimized for comfort, just complete. I created handover notes that explained what happened and when, but not why certain judgment calls were made. Not because I wanted to withhold insight, but because judgment is earned through context, not transferred through documents. Next, I reduced my footprint. I stopped attending meetings where my presence was assumed, but my input wasn't structurally required. I declined politely, citing focus and priorities. No one questioned it. They trusted I knew what mattered. I let my calendar breathe. Then quietly, I accepted another offer. It wasn't flashy. No dramatic salary leap or inflated title. Just a role that named my work clearly, compensated it honestly, and placed decision-making authority where responsibility lived. When I signed the contract, I felt no surge of triumph, only relief. I still hadn't told anyone at work. I waited for a natural moment, not because I feared their reaction, but because I wanted to leave the way I had worked, cleanly, without forcing urgency where none existed. When I finally scheduled the meeting with my manager, my tone was calm, professional, unapologetic. "I've decided to move on," I said. "I wanted to give proper notice and make sure the transition is smooth." He blinked, paused, asked where I was going. I answered simply. That's when the questions started. Not aggressive, just surprised. "Is something wrong? We were planning to evolve your role." "This is sudden." None of it was sudden. It was just the first time they were hearing about a process that had already completed internally. I offered a clear transition plan. I named timelines. I outlined what I would and wouldn't be able to cover during notice. I didn't list grievances. I didn't reference the raise. I didn't mention the new hire. There was nothing to argue with, and because there was no heat, no threat, no demand, no one tried to stop me. They thanked me, said they were sorry to lose me, said they'd miss my presence. All of that was true. What they didn't yet understand was what my absence would actually mean. That realization hadn't arrived. Not yet. The first consequences didn't look like consequences. They looked like minor inconveniences, small delays, harmless confusion, questions that arrived just a little too late in the process. The kind of things that happen in any organization and are usually smoothed over by someone competent and calm. By habit. By me. Except this time, I was already halfway out the door. During my notice period, I did exactly what I said I would do. No more, no less. I attended transition meetings. I answered questions clearly. I shared documentation. I flagged known risks in writing, with neutral language and realistic timelines. What I didn't do was hover. I didn't preempt confusion before it appeared. I didn't chase people down to clarify things they hadn't asked about. I didn't absorb last-minute urgency that wasn't part of the transition plan. At first, no one noticed. They assumed the system would hold because it always had. Then the cracks began to show. Not dramatically, but persistently. A deadline slipped because two teams each thought the other was handling an approval. In the past, I would have spotted the ambiguity early and resolved it quietly. This time, it escalated just enough to require a meeting. People laughed it off. These things happen. A report went out with inconsistent data, because the logic behind a manual adjustment hadn't been fully understood. The documentation explained how the adjustment worked, but not when it should be applied, or when it shouldn't. The error wasn't catastrophic, but it required explanation. Apologies. Extra labor. Still nothing alarming. Then came the questions. The new hire, now fully in their role, began reaching out more frequently. Not for training exactly, for interpretation. Does this scenario fall under X or Y? How did you usually handle this edge case? Is this something we escalate, or? I answered carefully, within the boundaries I'd set. When I handled it, I looked at A, B, and C. You'll need to decide what makes sense given current priorities. That was the truth. It just wasn't the shortcut they were hoping for. Leadership began to sense friction, not enough to assign blame, but enough to feel unease. Meetings grew longer. Agendas expanded. Decisions that once moved quickly now required follow-ups. Someone joked, lightly, "Wow, Luna really held a lot of this together, didn't she?" Everyone nodded. Still, no one panicked. The real shift happened after I left, not the first week. That was still buffered by momentum and optimism. People told themselves the adjustment period would pass. By the second month, patterns emerged. The same questions kept resurfacing. The same misunderstandings repeated themselves. The same small fires required more effort to put out. It wasn't that anyone was incompetent. It was that no one had the full picture. My absence didn't create chaos. It removed coherence. The organization had relied on me not just to execute tasks, but to interpret intent across silos. To sense when something needed intervention before it crossed a threshold. To recognize when technically correct wasn't operationally viable. Without that interpretive layer, everything still functioned, just slower, rougher, more expensively. I heard about this gradually, through former colleagues who reached out under the guise of catching up. At first, they were casual. "We miss you." "It's been an adjustment. You really did more than we realized." Later, the tone shifted. "We're still trying to figure out how you kept track of everything." "I didn't realize how many exceptions you were managing." Things feel heavier now. No one accused me of leaving them unprepared. They couldn't. Not honestly. I had done everything correctly. That was part of the discomfort. The consequences had no villain. Leadership tried to compensate in familiar ways. They added tools. They scheduled more syncs. They asked the new hire to step up strategically. But tools can't replace judgment. Meetings can't replace context. And pressure can't replace experience overnight. What they had lost wasn't labor. It was continuity of understanding. And continuity, once broken, is difficult to reconstruct. I later learned that my manager had revisited the compensation discussion internally, after I was gone. Not as an attempt to win me back, but as a post-mortem realization. "We should have addressed this sooner," he reportedly said. She was operating at a level we didn't formalize. Those words didn't reach me directly. And by the time they existed, they no longer mattered, because the consequence wasn't regret. The consequence was reorganization. Responsibilities were redistributed. New roles were proposed. Consultants were briefly discussed. Budgets adjusted. Not for growth, but for containment. All of this cost more than the raise I'd been promised. That irony wasn't satisfying, it was just factual. The most telling consequence, though, was subtler. People became more cautious. They stopped assuming someone would catch things quietly. They documented more, escalated earlier, hesitated before saying, "Luna will handle it," because Luna wasn't there anymore. And in her absence, the system had to face itself. I never gloated. I never corrected anyone when they said, "We didn't realize." Because realization after loss isn't accountability. It's processing. And I didn't need them to process anything for me. The consequence had already completed its arc. Not with collapse, not with blame, but with awareness that arrived too late to be useful. And that, I learned, is the most lasting consequence of all. By the time urgency appeared, the conditions for repair were already gone. It started quietly, the way most realizations do when people don't want to admit they've misread a situation. A message from my former manager, framed as a friendly check-in. "Hey Luna, hope you're settling in well. Quick question. Do you remember how you handled X when Y happened?" I answered politely. Briefly, I referenced the documentation. I didn't reopen conversations that had already ended. Then another message came, this time from someone else. We're revisiting some processes and realized you had context we might be missing. Again, I responded kindly. Clearly, at a distance. What none of them said, what hovered behind the words, was the growing awareness that something essential had left the building, and no one had noticed until the silence became operational. Leadership held meetings about knowledge gaps. They talked about resilience, about single points of failure, about how to prevent this from happening again. I wasn't part of those meetings, not because I was excluded, but because the time for inclusion had passed. Eventually, my manager asked if I'd be open to a conversation. Not an exit interview, we'd already had that. Something more reflective. I agreed, out of courtesy. The call was calm, careful. He spoke about how much the team was feeling my absence, how certain things were harder than expected, how they hadn't fully understood the scope of what I carried. I wish we'd known sooner, he said. I believed him, but knowing sooner would have required listening earlier, when the signals were quieter and less convenient. He mentioned the compensation conversation, finally, how it had been mishandled, how timing and structure had gotten in the way. I think we could have fixed it, he said, if we'd had more time. That was the moment I felt the finality settle in, not sharply, but completely. Because what he was offering wasn't repair, it was retroactive recognition, and retroactive recognition doesn't restore trust. It just explains why it broke. I thanked him for saying it. I meant that too. But I didn't reopen the door. By then, the system was already adapting. Awkwardly, expensively, imperfectly. New safeguards were being discussed. New roles scoped. New expectations clarified. All the things that could have protected me while I was there. Too late. What struck me most wasn't the regret in his voice. It was the confusion. They couldn't understand why I hadn't pushed harder, why I hadn't demanded clarity, why I hadn't made the imbalance impossible to ignore. And that's when I realized something important about systems like this. They rely on the ethical restraint of people inside them. They assume that those who carry the most will also carry the burden of self-advocacy, loudly, persistently, at personal cost. When someone refuses to do that, not out of passivity but out of principle, the system reads it as satisfaction, until it's too late. By the end of that call, there was nothing left to say. No anger, no bitterness, no unfinished business, just a shared understanding that the moment for correction had passed quietly, while everyone was focused elsewhere. I hung up and returned to my new work, where my role was clear, my boundaries respected, and my contributions named without me having to fight for language. The past didn't follow me there. It stayed where it belonged. If there was a confrontation, it didn't look like one. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no attempt to reclaim the narrative or assign blame. By the time we spoke again, formally this time, everything that could be felt had already been processed. The meeting happened weeks after I'd left. It was framed as a closure conversation. A chance, my manager said, to align on lessons learned. I agreed, knowing there would be nothing left to negotiate. We spoke calmly, like two professionals reviewing a completed project. He acknowledged the gap between my responsibilities and my title, the way my role had expanded without being formalized, the reliance that had developed quietly, without safeguards. I listened. When it was my turn, I didn't defend myself. I didn't recount grievances or list sacrifices. I simply described what it had been like to operate inside that ambiguity, how being trusted without authority slowly erodes clarity, how patience can be mistaken for permission. I told him I hadn't left because of one decision. I left because the system required me to keep proving my value after it had already been demonstrated, I said. And I didn't want to live inside that loop. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, just honest. He asked what they could have done differently. I answered carefully. Made the invisible visible sooner, I said. Not just for me, but for the system. So it didn't depend on silence. That was it. No heat. No moral high ground. No attempt to rewrite the past. The confrontation, such as it was, didn't aim to win. It aimed to name. And naming something, I've learned, is often the most disruptive act available, especially when it's done without emotion. At the end of the conversation, he thanked me again. Not reflexively this time, but with understanding. I believed that too. But understanding, like regret, arrives at its own pace. And mine had already moved on. I don't tell this story because I'm proud of how indispensable I once was. I tell it because I'm proud of who I chose to become afterward. Today, my life is quieter in a different way. Not the quiet of being unseen, but the quiet of being aligned. My work still involves complexity, still requires judgment, still asks me to hold responsibility. But now, it does so openly. My role is named. My authority is defined. My compensation matches the weight of what I carry. I no longer translate my worth into patience. What changed most, though, wasn't external. It was how I relate to silence. Silence is no longer my default response to discomfort. It's a tool, one I use deliberately, sparingly, and with full awareness of its impact. I speak earlier now, not louder. I clarify before resentment has a chance to grow. I make the invisible visible, not through performance, but through structure. I no longer assume that being ethical means being endlessly accommodating. Ethics, I've learned, also includes self-respect. I still train others, still document carefully, still care deeply about the health of systems and the people inside them. But I no longer confuse generosity with obligation. When I see someone being quietly over-relied upon, I name it. Not dramatically, just clearly. Because I know how easy it is to disappear inside usefulness. There's no bitterness in me toward my former workplace. Only understanding. They did what many systems do. They optimized for short-term stability without accounting for the cost of unacknowledged labor. They relied on someone's composure instead of building resilience. I don't need them to apologize again. I don't need validation retroactively. The clarity I gained there travels with me now. It shapes how I choose environments, how I set boundaries, how I recognize when a system is asking for more than it is willing to hold responsibly. If I sound calmer now, it's because I am. Not because nothing weighs on me, but because nothing is misaligned. And that, for me, is the quietest form of dominance there is. There's a temptation, when telling stories like this, to end with a warning. To say, don't let this happen to you, or never trust a system that doesn't see you. But life is more complicated than that. And people are more complicated too. Most harm doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from convenience. From systems that quietly rely on the best-behaved people to absorb the most complexity. From environments that reward those who speak early and often, while mistaking composure for consent. From the assumption that patience is infinite, simply because it has been generous. The moral of this story isn't that you should leave the moment you feel unseen. It's that being needed is not the same as being valued. And if a system only recognizes your worth once you're gone, that recognition isn't corrective. It's explanatory. It explains why the loss hurts, but it doesn't change why it happened. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about choosing alignment over approval, clarity over comfort, self-respect over delayed promises. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop compensating for what others haven't built and walk away without making it anyone's fault. No shouting, no humiliation, no revenge. Just accuracy. If this story resonated with you, it might be because you've felt that tension yourself, the sense that you're holding more than anyone realizes, and wondering whether it will ever be named without you forcing it into the open. So I'll leave you with one question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever stayed quiet, hoping your value would be recognized on its own? And if so, what did that silence ultimately cost you?
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.